After 3 long months of the Proving Ground circuit, we finally have come away with 6 amateur teams who qualified through the Tier 1 tournaments for the main event. Those 6 teams are, in order of qualification, No.org, Zeus Gaming, Evil Geniuses Prodigies, Wildcard Gaming, Barrage North America, and Dignitas.Mirage. Relative to the teams that qualified for Scouting Grounds playoffs last year, I think these teams are more varied in their playstyle and have more identifiable traits relative to last year's teams, which makes them more interesting to talk about and discuss. No.org's roster is a powerhouse. They've won 3 of the 4 tournaments they've played in throughout the Proving Ground circuit, and they were the first team to qualify for Proving Grounds. No.org's consistent rival throughout the circuit in No Money Gaming dissolved shortly before the Proving Grounds event commenced, further removing them from the rest of the amateur pack. No.org's biggest strength is their powerful topside in Viper and Onda. Viper receives counterpick priority in the majority of games, and he's a top laner's worst nightmare since he has an arsenal of ranged picks which are irritating to watch if you have any sense of human empathy for the enemy top laner. Despite Viper playing extremely aggressive, his understanding of gank timers makes him very difficult to gank. And alongside this, he sets up dives with Onda exemplary well relative to the rest of the amateur pack. Speaking of Onda, he's the best jungler in the amateur circuit by a large margin. He's a lower gank frequency jungler with a high success rate. He hovers on the correct waves and understands the degree of pressure he needs to send to a lane in order to effectively cover for it. As in, he doesn't overcommit to a gank when he just needs to stand around a lane to deter enemy pressure or crash a wave. The bottom side of No.org is solid too. Fire is a solid mid laner, although the gap between him and the rest of the amateur mid laners has closed to a degree. Value and Big are a good bottom lane, but I think that they can have a hard time against bottom lanes that are more easygoing and don't have the impetus to win the game through sheer punishing laning. No.org's rival in Zeus Gaming is a good example, and Dignitas.Mirage for reasons we'll cover later. I think No.org can go far in the event and even finish top 4 if they play to their strengths. And I think Onda in particular was LCS caliber last Academy split, and I think he's still better than most, if not all of the Academy junglers. Zeus Gaming is a team with a lot of surprises, mostly due to Captain Alorum and his pool of top lane champions. Urgot, Swain, amongst others, allows Zeus to experiment with unique compositions. Unfortunately, while I think Zeus are a solid team, they can have a hard time closing out games if mid laner and primary carry Darkwings doesn't get off the ground. That is seldom an issue though, since he's one of the strongest mid laners in the circuit and his team actively plays for his success. Support Pocket Rhino was a solid addition to the squad, since he generally has a good idea of when he can leave lane to affect the map and support RBM's invades. Him and Raheen make a solid bottom lane that doesn't need to actively play for kills in the early to middle game. Raheen is fine in lane, but I sometimes find him lacking in later game teamfights relative to some of the other AD carries on this list. He just doesn't have the killer instinct of a player like Team Luke, Shiro, or Meech, but he does possess good fundamentals. However, Zeus doesn't necessarily need a gold vacuum AD carry like the aforementioned to pop off in teamfights. They're more than comfortable having an AD carry who is dependable in the early to mid game and function as a secondary carry. Zeus should be comfortable in their match against TSM Academy, and I'm excited to see Darkwings versus Sword, especially on 11.6 post-Akali changes, and Alorum versus Hanser in particular. I do wish that Proving Grounds was played on 11.7 instead of 11.6, so we could potentially see Alorum's Yorick match up into one of Hanser's signature champions in Gangplank. Evil Geniuses Prodigies was a team that's starting the Proving Ground circuit relatively strong after being the kings of amateur in the offseason. They were an early innovator of Aphelios and Thresh to counter Kai'Sa being bonkers broken before teams consistently started picking up Xayah, and that sort of bottom lane combination is telling to how EGP plays. Shiro is definitely a player to watch out for in the bottom lane, and he was one of the few players that held the Samira that rivaled Gorika's when she was in the meta. His positioning on the lower range AD carries, like Kai'Sa or the Samira, is definitely impressive, and he certainly earns the moniker Dan Kai'Sa. I talked about Surdy in my last video, and while I think he's still a great player, I think as teams become more creative with their counter picks and less likely to handshake tank versus tank matchups, it's becoming more challenging since he can't just mechanically outplay his opponent in order to win the laning phase. Similarly, the jungle meta shifting away from Graves and Talia has also curtailed Tomio's power, who can sometimes have a hard time finding the same impact on picks like Udyr and translating the farm leads he usually plays for throughout the early to mid game. That being said, Camille, Shen, and Gragas for Surdy, and Hecarim and Olaf for Tomio are just some champions that are still playable in the meta that have come up big for each player, but these picks just have more answers now relative to in the past. Mid laner Aspect is a solid mid laner who unlocks Tomio by playing for priority throughout the early game and has a good understanding of when he's capable of being punished by the enemy jungler, but the mid laners who have traditionally gained this priority in Azir and Syndra being pushed out of the meta may make it difficult for him to continue doing so, particularly when he doesn't often get counterpick. I say these things not because I doubt EGP, just because I find it interesting that the destabilization of the meta they built their synergy and comfort in presents them challenges that are unique relative to the other teams. But their qualification from Giant Slayer's Gauntlet has allowed them a considerable amount of time to acclimatize to the meta shifts and rediscover themselves, and I'm interested in seeing what they bring to the table against Immortals Academy, specifically in the mid-jungle matchup in Tomio and Aspect versus Potluck and Pretty, and Shiro versus Keith is another matchup I'm very excited to watch. Wildcard Gaming is probably the team with the most variance in my mind. One day they're 2-0ing the best amateur team ever devised in money laundering esports, and the next they're dropping games to Cloud9 Amateur and Revival. Team Luke has been a great AD carry, and I consider him unique in the regard that he is fantastic in both lane and team fights, with little to no drop-off between the two, no bias. Zeno is a mid laner who has a diverse skill set, and while I think he can occasionally screw up his trade timings and lane mechanics, he is an insane X-factor in team fights and does a magnificent job at coordinating priority to support jungler Panda, who has brought a big voice to the team and has led them well throughout the early game. Top laner Quacker is one of the most improved players throughout the circuit in my opinion, and has evolved from being a Darius one-trick to having a grand total of 3 champions in his pool. Congratulations to Quacker. Obviously, I'm joking, but I think Quacker is a player who came from solo queue and made an insane amount of progress in his 4 months in amateur. He used to be the most exploitable part in Wildcard, and now he has a much more comprehensive understanding of when he needs to take certain actions to shield his lane from enemy jungler aggression. A much better understanding of how to play the first several waves, and how to coordinate with jungler Panda on the top side. Support Daption I also consider to be one of the most improved players over this entire year, coming from CLT Phoenix during Scattering Ground Circuit. Like Rhino though, he's a dirty enter, and more unstable than a Gumbok. He's evolved well from primarily a ranged support player into being well-rounded and having a diverse champion pool with a strong laning phase alongside Team Luke. This goes without saying, but I love all of my players. I just don't want to go too in-depth and spill the sauce on any of the strategies we've been cooking up for the event. Barrage is a team that deserved to qualify way earlier than they actually did, especially since their team is comprised of 4 23 and under-year-old senior citizens and youngster L9 Frycook APA. The removal of Azir from the meta has allowed Barrage to be more variable in their play, as their signature counterpick in Vigar doesn't do much to punish the pick in the laning phase, alongside with APA lacking the pick in his pool himself. APA's pool is relatively expansive, and I think it only gets better since the aforementioned Azir and Syndra are getting phased out of the meta. Zoe will definitely come back during Proving Grounds, and I wonder if we will see APA Swain again into the pick, alongside other picks like Galio. Fnatic is the second best jungler in the circuit, and while I find him comfortable in the farm meta of Season 11, I am glad to see the meta shift towards more gank-inclined junglers. I just wish Rek'Sai took off, since I enjoyed seeing him on those sort of champions. Skarner and Nocturne, amongst others, comprise some of his unique picks, and while these sort of champions are weaker in the early stages of the game, they really let Barrage shine, since all of his laners facilitate him very well and allow him to farm comfortably. Barrage, despite their laners who play for push, have a relatively slow early game, which isn't a bad thing, just that they prefer to use their lane pressure to accumulate a farm lead and then transition that lead into a mid-game teamfight, as opposed to immediately smashing their face through a brick wall in contrast to a team like Wildcard. Gorica is a great AD carry, and likely the best in the amateur circuit overall. And it's clear that despite Golden Guardians releasing him, he's learned a lot from the environment, and he's the most consistent player in his position. Winter has great tank positioning, and while many people talk about his Alistar, I actually think Galio is his best champion, since I think it's the pick that lets his main strengths shine in his control of space and roam timing. PCL is a good top laner, but I think he's a little bit more exploitable relative to the rest of the map. A little due to Barrage's generally slow early game, leaving him susceptible to jungle aggression, a little on his own part due to some weird trade timings, but he is solid though, and capable of holding his own, even against heavy hitters like Viper, without asking too much from Fnatic. Finally, Dignitas.Mirage, the final team to qualify for Proving Grounds. I will try my best to avoid any low-hanging jokes about their team. Top laner Dragoon has come a long way from his games last year in SGC, and his pool is much more developed. His Gangplank in particular has gotten a lot better, and he still holds his Pocket Darius that's a 100% must ban. He also holds a Pocket Alawi, and a Jax when all else fails to counter carry top laners. He's capable on the weak side on mainstay tanks like Malphite and Ornn, but the only real issue I can perceive from the games I've watched is he has a hard time playing the early game jungle facilitating champions that can easily get priority that aren't Darius. I consider Darius unique in the regard that it's really dangerous to gank him, and a decent amount of time you're better off not doing so. But Dragoon's Renekton hasn't astounded me, and they rarely pick it anymore, just as an example. He doesn't really have a Gnar either, and his Volibear in the past has been alright, but it has similar issues to the aforementioned picks, and I just don't think Volibear top is a fantastic pick right now either. One unique pick that Dragoon has picked up that ameliorates this issue is the reintroduction of a top lane set, which works on a similar principle, unchallenged early game priority into a decent spread of matchups. Dragoon is a good top laner, but he can have a hard time working with Hayami, and that can cause issues for the top side of Dignitas.Mirage throughout the mid game, despite the fact that I think neither player is 100% culpable. Hayami has shifted towards a bit more conservative pull in the past, and while he's faced criticism, I think he does a good job at setting up his carries and teamfights on picks like Skarner and Udyr, just like he did last year for Robbie Bomb on picks like Rek'Sai, Trundle, Jarvan 4, and Gragas. It's taken some time to find his groove with his new team and mid laner DNA, who is another player that has shown considerable progress throughout the split. DNA's main champion, Syndra, getting nudged out of the meta has been to DNA's benefit in my opinion, and he has had to learn and experiment with different champions as opposed to relying on what I perceive as somewhat of a crutch blind in his signature pick. Orianna and Victor are obvious choices, but his Cassiopeia versus Barrage single-handedly carried the game, and his Anivia was really good while that was flavor of the month too. I have high hopes for him, and I'm interested in seeing how he will match up against Copy. Finally, we have Mirage's bottom lane, Meech and King, which are an interesting parallel to a bottom lane like Team Luke and Daption. Whereas Luke and Daption actively play for kills and all in the enemy bottom lane throughout the game, Meech and King are still aggressive, but way more conservative in their play. Instead of just all-inning you, Meech and King play for HP trades on farm, chipping away at their opponent's HP. This is enabled by King's propensity to pick range supports way more frequently relative to the other amateur supports. Morgana, Nico, and Karma, just to name a few. King is more than capable of playing Alistar and Rel too, but even on these picks, I wouldn't necessarily characterize Mirage's bottom lane as being aggressive or thirsty for kills throughout the early game. They mostly play for farm advantage and plate chip, anything that can give them a slight edge after a laning phase without the need of unnecessary or risky confrontation with the enemy bottom lane. Meech is the main carry on Dignitas.Mirage, and his teamfighting in particular likely contends with Gorica for best in all of Amateur, but his team does a great job setting him up and controlling space so he can maximize his damage output. That's it for me. Whether the amateur teams do well in Proving Grounds or not isn't really a concern to me. I think they've already shown more than enough to the public to demonstrate that every single team has players worth examining for an academy spot, and I think that each of them fully deserve to be at the event. I'm excited to see them match up against the higher placed academy teams, and I fully believe that at least one of them will make a deep run, and the likelihood for upsets is extremely high, since I think that at least one, if not multiple academy teams, will underestimate the amateur teams and will try to ego on them. It's been a while since my last video, but I'm actively working on another one, and I just wanted to speed up my work on this one since the event is about to begin, and I wanted to get it out before Proving Grounds begins. Thanks to the King's GFX for the thumbnail as always, and have a good day.